Assalamualaikum and good day, my fellow classmates, especially to our dynamic professor, Brother Jose Arnold Alferez, OCDS. Hello po, Sir Joe Ars. Well, anyway, I am Sharian and Baraguir, your discussant for this video lesson. So the topic that I chose to share is all about the indigenous people movement. I will be discussing some of the movements that are international and of course local in our country setting. So without further ado, let us start with defining what is indigenous people. Or shall I ask, what comes in your mind if you happen to hear the word indigenous? What are the things that will associate in your imagination if you encounter indigenous? Okay, so indigenous people. So I want to take a look at this photo. This is an example of an indigenous people, and I know you are all familiar with their dresses, as you can see. Of course, they are from Philippines. Look at the colors and the hairy dresses. I know you are all familiar with this. So indigenous people are culturally distinct societies and communities. They are distinct and social and cultural groups that share collective ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources where they live, occupy, or from which they have been displaced. The land and natural resources on which they depend are inextricably linked to their identities, cultures, livelihood, as well as their physical and spiritual well-being. They often subscribe to their customary leaders and organizations for representation that are distinct or separate from those or of the mainstream society or culture. So many indigenous people still maintain a language distinct from the official language that we have or we share, or language of the country or region in which they reside. However, many have also lost their languages or on the precipice of extinction due to eviction from their lands and the relocation to the territories that they're in. So bakit kaya ganun no, mga indigenous people? They are considered as native, pero bakit sila yung lagi nalang aalis kung may mga bagong darating? So, okay. Moving on. There are an estimated 476 million indigenous peoples worldwide. Although they make up just 6% of the global population, they account for about 19% of the extreme poor. So indigenous people, life expectancy is up to 20 years lower than the life expectancy of non-indigenous people worldwide. Indigenous people often lack of formal recognition over their lands, territories, and natural resources. And they are often last to receive public investment in basic services of infrastructures, multiple barriers to participate fully in formal economy, and they cannot even access to justice. They cannot even participate in political processes and decision making. So this legacy of inequality and exclusion has made the indigenous people more vulnerable to those impacts of climate change and natural hazards. So that's why nagkaroon ng indigenous people movement, because they feel this inadequate support system in the community as a whole. This movement exists due to unequal opportunity that they are facing. So, bakit nagkaroon ng ganun, no? Pag sinabi mo bang indigenous people, parang nade-deprive na sila masyado. So, whatever access that we have sa indigenous people movement, take a look at their logo. So they are a collective of various indigenous people from all over the world, from all nations, uniting in the stand against issues that directly affect their lands, people, and respective cultures. It, this group aims to have a place where they can stand together, speak for truth, and collaborate. Indigenous people movement is uniting indigenous peoples from across the world to stand together to bring awareness to the issues affecting indigenous men, women, children, and two spirits. So indigenous peoples from North, Central, and South America, Oceania, Asia, Africa, and Caribbean are the target of genocide. So these are the nations across the world na nagkaroon ng mga social movements to support indigenous people. And they have their mission. So we want to eliminate the borders of our injustices. Si indigenous people, sample nito, itong photo naman na ito is Indian American. So as you can see, parang they are so native. Pero bakit ganun, no? Ikaw ang native, pero ikaw ang kinakawawa. So that's real life. So indigenous people movement. So 2007 was a watershed year for indigenous rights. So on September 13, 2007, United Nations adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and it has since been ratified by 143 countries. While the declaration is not legally binding, it sets a global standard for the treatment of indigenous people. So this was a vital step in securing indigenous rights worldwide. That year also was a historic development in the private sector relationship with indigenous peoples, with the help from First People Worldwide, the corporate engagement initiatives, the Indigenous Peoples Working Group of U.S. Social Investment Forum led a campaign to educate and motivate the shareholders of Newmont Mining, a major extractive corporation operating in indigenous territories. So the movement is a single unifying issue facing indigenous people everywhere is how to protect their territories and stop the asset stripping that robs them of their livelihoods and the foundation of their culture. So without land and control of their assets, indigenous people are destined to remain world poorest communities with the world's health highest mortality rate and shortest lifespan. So through legal battles, public awareness campaigns, partnerships with governments, corporations, and other organizations, indigenous-led development efforts worldwide network of indigenous advocates. So indigenous people have made huge progress in securing their rights over the last 10 years. So ito yung mga new global indigenous movement. I'll mention it. Indigenous leaders all over the world are taking action to defend their rights and their people. So they ensure and use the success to create linkages between indigenous leaders, organization, and their partners so that no community acts alone. So they create linkages between indigenous leaders and governments, organization, businesses, and other local or regional or international levels para hindi lang sila mapag-iwanan. So this is an example of indigenous people. Sami from Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Denmark. So First Nation Métis are from Canada, then Native Americans, United States, then Maasai, East Africa, then Kurds, Western Asia, then Maori, New Zealand. Okay, Okay, so, oh, here, I know you're familiar again with the photo. Kasi syempre, this is from Philippines. So, sa Philippines naman, there is an indigenous people in the Philippines. There is a Republic Law 8371 known as the Indigenous People Rights Acts or IPRA was enacted in 1997. It has been praised for its support for the cultural integrity of indigenous peoples, the rights to their lands, and the rights to self-directed development of these lands. So the indigenous people are grouped in the mountains of northern Luzon are collectively known as the Igorot, while the groups of the southern island of Mindanao are collectively called Lumad. There are smaller groups collectively known as Mangyan in the central island and even smaller scattered groups in central island of Luzon. So, yun yung mga well-known na mga indigenous people that are identified in our country. So, what are the main challenges for the indigenous people of the Philippines? Indigenous people participated in the electoral processes by representing their own political party. So, sulong katribo to represent their interests in the 2016 national election. Pero at least naman kasi dito sa atin, sa Philippines, nowadays naman, meron na din namang nagpa-participate ng mga indigenous people, even in the Congress, diba? Meron na din silang mga representative, kaya, pero, hindi na din naman ganun ka-hot issues, hindi siya included pala sa hot issue itong mga parang oppression naman, kasi, nagkaroon na din naman ng innovation dito sa atin, dito sa area natin, na unti-unti na-educate na rin naman sila. So, these are some sample photos ng mga movements na dito nangyari sa ating bansa. This one. Okay, Gurotan, lumaban sa Cordillera People's Alliance. So, this one. Sa Cordillera pa rin. And some other movements. So, that ends my report. So, thank you for listening and have a good day always. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.